So, welcome everyone. We are joined here today by Flight of Eros and Armunn, and Zeal may join as well later on. And yeah, we're going to be doing a discussion on, guess, in general, the philosophy of the Lord of the Rings. We're going to touch upon some major topics within that sort of philosophical framework, but I've brought on Eros and Armunn because, well, they're the most knowledgeable guys that I know to discuss this topic, and I'm going to be sitting here listening intently and sort of soaking it all up and learning, hopefully asking the right questions, and yeah, they're going to be providing the answers effectively.
No. You're not going to hide in the bush. No. You're going to step forward. Hello, everyone.
Well, if you want to introduce yourselves and just give a sort of brief background of your interest into Tolkien's work and perhaps where it started as well.
To be honest, and being completely honest with you, I was totally unaware that Tolkien even existed before the movies came out. But once they did, I think it was after the second movie, I actually bought the books and read them and found that although at the time, now I don't so much, but at the time I really liked the movies versions of Lord of the Rings, I found that they were not really depicting and consistently carrying the original message of the books in a lot of aspects. And so it grew my interest to explore further into Tolkien's works. Of course, The Hobbit followed. And then I went into the, let's say, post, what's it called? Posthumous releases that his son edited and put together. But have some interest as well, although you clearly see it's not the same writer, right? Yes, in terms of the philosophy behind it, yes, it was. I found a lot of interesting things there. Although I also, came to understand that Tolkien was depicting necessarily a Manichaeistic viewpoint with all of his works, which is something that later down the line I came to leave behind. But I still love the literature and certain aspects of the works themselves. I still hold close as inspiration even today. So I hope that answers the question, Sal.
Perfectly. How about you, Eros?
Yeah, I think I must have been about, I don't know, 11 years old maybe or something when I first read The Lord of the Rings. I started with Lord of the Rings. Don't remember exactly. It was a few years, I think, before the movies had come out. And I just always was reading. I'd kind of mentioned a bit of my history before, and I always go to the library, and my parents let me check it out because they thought it had decent Christian themes about it. And so they were like, okay, that's fine. You can read that. So I read it, found it absolutely intriguing, loved it. Didn't read any of the other literature. I was still fairly young, and I didn't return to Tolkien in terms of reading, Silmarillion and Unfinished Tales and all the other like Armunn said, posthumous works until years later. I was in my 20s, I think, by that time, maybe like mid 20s, when I actually went and read through everything. And much like Armunn, found it very inspiring. Found it just completely engrossing in terms of the level of detail he had put into everything, and how well all the stories, once you kind of get into the more extended literature, how everything just sort of weaves into all the other plot lines around the Lord of the Rings, but before it as well. So just found it fascinating, and then as I developed in my understanding through other forms of studying philosophy and research and everything else, just began to notice that there were some critical themes that Tolkien was striking on, kind of getting at some of the heart of reality, if you want to talk about in terms of like using a very vague term there. And then so found, a further level of inspiration and understanding from that point as well.
Splendid. So before we go on to Numenor, I think we have to sort of lay the groundwork regarding both the philosophy and I guess you could call it the ontology within Tolkien's universe. So the greatest of the gods is that of Eru Iluvatar, which is sort of akin to, I guess you could say, the pleroma in the Gnostic sense. This sort of great one, this agnostos theos, the unknown god, the god beyond both space and time, yet the creator of it all. And so he's distinct from all of the other gods who are created. He is the sort of uncreated one, or the self-begotten deity above all things, and from whence all things return and stem from. So we, for example, find that man has a very interesting destiny and gift that has been provided by Eru Iluvatar, and that is the gift of death. Now, unlike the elves are deathless, they're timeless, they're unchanging. Man, of course, is, because of this sort of strife of death, this sword of Damocles always looming over him, he is pushed to greater and greater heights. And I guess the idea is that through the suffering of death, that he will grow, both spiritually, psychologically, and he will become, in the end, a better steward for the world. So we see within the beginning, in the creation myth, that all things are created from singing, from a sort of divine vibratory frequency that is sung out by a choir of the Ainur, I believe they're called. And the greatest amongst these is that of Melkor. And Melkor would eventually become the first Dark Lord. Of course, he would be the predecessor to Sauron, who was his protege. And so I'll just read this part, and then any of you can then jump in on your thoughts regarding this ontology and perhaps its philosophical implications. It states, quote, but and by the way, this is from the Silmarillion, page 2, quote, but now Iluvatar sat and hearkened, and for a great while it seemed good to him, for in the music there was no flaws, but as the theme progressed, it came into the heart of Melkor to interweave matters of his own imagining, that were not in accord with the theme of Iluvatar. For he sought therein to increase the power and glory of the part assigned to himself. To Melkor among the Ainur had been given the greatest gifts of power and knowledge, and he had a share in all the gifts of his brethren. And he had gone often alone into the void places, seeking the imperishable flame, for desire grew hot within him to bring into being things of his own, and it seemed to him that Iluvatar took no thought for the void, and he was impatient of its emptiness, yet he found not the fire, for it is with Iluvatar, but being alone, he had begun to conceive thoughts of his own, unlike those of his brethren. And then continuing on, some of these thoughts he now wove into his music, and straightway discord arose about him, and many that sang nigh him grew despondent, and their thought was disturbed, and their music faltered, and some began to attune their music to his rather than to the thought which they had at first. Then the discord of Melkor spread ever wider, and the melodies which had been heard at first foundered in a sea of turbulent sound, but Iluvatar sat and hearkened until it seemed that about his throne there was a raging storm as of dark waters that made war one upon the other, in an endless wrath that would not be assuaged. So what are your opinions upon this idea as, that Eru provided man the gift of death. And even perhaps, going in a little bit into Numenor, that Melkor utilized that to instill fear and to even antagonize the fear that man naturally had of death and the unknown, to thus manipulate him. And perhaps any thoughts you have on the creation myth itself.
Well, those are two different subjects. One is starting with what you read. First of all, it's a rewriting, let's say, of the Paradise Lost, right? Myth of the Lucifer as being eventually cast down for wanting to be, having a more prominent role. But the implication there, of course, is Eru Iluvatar, in the same way as, the one deities all across different, religions, spiritualities, whatever, that are monotheistic, is considered to be, of course, omniscient and omnipotent, right? And so he created the Einar, and Melkor was also his creation. So for Melkor to oppose him, and for Eru Iluvatar to see that as a confrontation, and also the void that is talked about, that was also Eru Iluvatar's creation, whether wittingly or not. So that brings again a conversation that we had, that is recorded, and that we had a long time ago. I think it was that conversation we had about Paradise Lost, which is that if we are to take the symbolic, what happens is that when the, let's say, creator, for lack of a better expression, because it's not an entity per se, but once it establishes a consciousness, a focused consciousness, it sees itself as a mirror, right? And so it asks the question, who am I? And through that question, his own self is reflected back at him, and there's a division there, because then there's me and the reflection, right? So it becomes two in that sense, right? This is exactly what is happening here, of course, in a different literary way, which is the music, etc., is that he is asking, let's say, in the creation that is going on, he is asking and projecting, who am I? Right? And so he is projecting his own being, and everything around him is in harmony with the perceived, let's say, with the first perception of his image that, for example, excluded the void, right? As if the void didn't come from him, and something else created, which can't be in its own literary format, right? Everything came from Eru Iluvatar. So as he projects forward, there's one aspect of him that tells him, but you forget the void, and you made us into being, and you just want us to play along and follow along your own instructions. But we are part of you, and we are also dissonant, and we also have the capacity for dissonance. So you are not, beings are not, of one mind, let's say. There is some disagreement, some dissonance necessary to being a whole being. And so the thing there, in a symbolic manner, is a part of Eru Iluvatar rebels against the self-image of Eru Iluvatar, of the one God, right? And it rebels by saying that you think that image you have of yourself is the whole thing, but it isn't, and I'm going to show you that it isn't. So he creates this dissonance, and eventually, later on, he is cast down to from the throne, and so on and so forth. This is basically the same as Paradise Lost. So it is both in that Tolkien universe and outside of it, just as a matter of analysis, it is Eru Iluvatar all the way through. Melkor is Eru Iluvatar. He is just the shadow, became a shadow of a rejected part, because Eru Iluvatar had a self-image that said, I am only this quote-unquote good part, and all the bad quote-unquote evil part, which is the void and the dissonance and all that, that is not me, right? So that is subject number one. Subject number two, about death, that is the same as the knowledge of good and evil, right? So it harkens back to the biblical idea of the knowledge of good and evil, which is if ask, if you could ask any being if they are afraid of death without a specific threat in front of them, right? Usually, in a healthy circumstance, they are not. I don't know. A butterfly lives like what, 1, 2, or 3 days at most, something like that. A turtle would supposedly live 100 years or more. And none of them think, oh, am I approaching the end of my life? No, that is not present. It doesn't mean that they are not aware of what death may be. It is just that it is not in their psyche occupying a prominent space, you understand? And so, of course, the idea of death given to man is, in a sense, Eru Iluvatar again playing the serpent, in the sense, the serpent in the Garden of Eden. So he opposes himself because he gives them knowledge that you are going to die eventually, right? So treat this not as an absolute, although in the literary works it is, but not as an absolute, but as a symbol, which is, by men being mortal, means that they know they are going to die while the elves don't. You understand? So I think that this gives man the same result as those, as Adam and Eve, that got the knowledge of good and evil. Right? So it turns them into a duality. You can have good men and you can have evil men. Right? And so this is the result, and all the evil men, supposedly the Black Numenorians, that turned to Sauron, they turned to Sauron because of death. So because of this knowledge of good and evil, right? They didn't before, right? It was because of them getting aware of their limited time span that they turned to it. So I think that the literary device here that Tolkien used was equivalent, in the sense of death is treated in the same way as the knowledge of good and evil is in the Bible. So that would be my initial comment, but I'll let Flight of Eros step in now.
Yeah, I would essentially agree. Anytime you take a monotheistic position, right, a being all omniscient, omnipresent, omnipotent. Well, as we've discussed before, that's a contradiction in terms, right? I mentioned that argument before because a being like that does not have any length of duration, so it can't exist. And Martin Heidegger makes a similar argument that all being must be limited by definition. And so it's sort of a non-starter that there is an omniscient, omnipotent, eternal God. But if we're going to take it like as a conceptual framework to kind of just like discuss in terms of theory within the context here of Lord of the Rings, or really any monotheistic religion, given those attributes assigned to that God, absolutely that good or evil, destruction and repair, what peace, war, whatever you want, whatever duality you want to present, would ultimately source itself in that being, 100%. Right. So this is said explicitly, essentially, in the text of the Bible. Romans chapter 9, right? Really big on this. The Old Testament's full of this, so it's not hidden anywhere. All all occurrences, all occasions must find their ultimate cause within that originating source. It's just basic philosophy. So I would absolutely agree there. Um, in terms of like Melkor as his shadow, I definitely see that. And what you actually have in Tolkien is you'll have like he'll fractalize like a theme like this. So Melkor is Iluvatar's shadow, and then Ungoliant is the shadow of Melkor, right? Which is why Melkor fears Ungoliant, right, the spider, and he needs an Ungoliant to actually get into Valinor to get to the two trees to sap the light, and she actually provides a cloak of darkness for him. But she's this all-devouring void, essentially. And once she drinks the light of the two trees, she basically turns on Melkor and wants to destroy him as well. And then the Balrogs have to come and save Melkor, essentially, right, away from Ungoliant. And then Tolkien writes later that she essentially just ends up devouring herself, although her spawn lives on with Shelob and all these other things. So that's sort of like the shadow of Melkor, and Melkor is the shadow of Iluvatar. So we have shadows upon shadows upon shadows. And that's one thing I always found quite profound, is that that's what I'm talking about, that ability to like weave and echo themes throughout multiple scenarios and multiple characters. But I guess within this framework, I'd ask you, Armunn, in terms of like, so you did, I might have missed it. Did you say that the Ainur, Melkor, and then by implication all other beings would be essentially Eru Iluvatar himself?
Yes, yes. That is exactly what I'm saying. So that the throne room of God, or in this literary work, the throne room of Eru Iluvatar, is the psyche, right? And so whatever is inside the throne room is part of the psyche, and I'm talking about the part of the psyche that is visible in the mind, right? So the void is invisible; it's not present there. It's still part of the psyche, but it's not in the conscious space. Let's say in the part that you can look at and see, right? But all the congregation, let's say, in the throne room, is Eru Iluvatar's own psyche. So in this case, you could say it's Tolkien's own psyche, right? Where, or every man's psyche, for that matter, But yes, that is exactly what I'm saying. Yes.
I see. But and so with that analysis, though, are you containing that just to Lord of the Rings, or are you saying that you're not monotheistic, correct? That's
No.
is that correct? Okay, so then in terms of like all aspects of being an aspect of a singular being, you wouldn't hold that for, let's say, our reality, but you're saying within Tolkien's world, that's what he is. That's what he's displaying here.
Yes, because, well, first of all, he was Catholic, but I also, you know, the religious symbology, in my opinion, that is literalized, so that it's made as an external literal thing, or interpreted as an external literal thing, all relates, in my opinion, to internal psychological processes. So everything that is, for example, you hear the one God, right? The one God is the one God within a certain psyche. But we all, in a sense, we all have the one God, right? But we are not all the one God, right? We have, all of us have 2 arms, 2 legs, etc., but they're not all the same, right? So the structure of things psychologically is similar to all of us. But the problem with literalization is that then it becomes something external that is being conveyed instead of the internal psychological symbolism that it's trying to not manifest, but convey, right? So yes, to me, the containment, let's say, when we write a story, okay, imagine you're writing a story now, all the characters in that story, or even better, when you have a dream, right? You can have a dream that you have a crowd around you, thousands of people, it doesn't matter. All of those people are you, because you are the dreamer, right? You are the one having the dream, and therefore, thousands of people in your dream are being manifested as representatives of aspects of you, aspects that you may know about, aspects that you were never aware that you had. It doesn't matter. They're all from you because they only exist while you dream, right? So in that same manner, everything in those stories is depicting the author. So if we were to imagine, and of course I'm not saying that, but if we were to imagine that the Bible was actually the Word of God and God really did write the Bible, everything that goes on in the Bible is happening inside of God, is depicting what God is psychologically, right? All the aspects, the pleasant and unpleasant, the cruel and the loving, and etc., etc. Right? The same thing here happens with Tolkien and with many other, of course, writings all across the board. But yes, I hope I conveyed correctly the answer to your question. I don't know if it was a bit confusing or not, but
No, no, and I'll probably have a good round of questions because I've been wanting to get to your book to read your book, but you know how busy I am, and I got like a list of books I'm working through, and your book's on the list, and I'm like I got to get to Armunn's book because it's very very interesting to me. I'm always very enamored by especially any like new viewpoints or paradigms on like whatever the subject is, but psychology especially because it's been kind of quiet for a while, right
yeah.
after Lacan and Freud and everybody. So I definitely want to get to it, but I'm trying to like because I know you're coming at this from your perspective, so I do want to see as much as I can kind of reap from your perspective here. So when you say though, like when you dream and all of the elements of your dream are aspects of yourself, and that and when you wake up they cease to exist. So well, how would we know that they cease to exist? Simply because you're just not aware of them anymore.
Yes,
And
well,
then
yeah, I say cease to exist in that immediacy of consciousness. Of course, doesn't cease to exist in the background, but yes, cease to exist in that regard. It's like, it's not visible immediately there, right? When you wake up, those aspects will, of course, remain with you, but they are not in the forefront. That's what I meant by that. Go ahead. Sorry.
oh, I see. Okay. So it's just that you're just not like they're not immediately present, like ready at hand in front
Right.
of you. But they could still exist in some sense of the word
Yes.
exist. They're just not immediately apparent. Got it. Okay. All right. Okay. Yeah. No. I think that's a great analysis of the beginning portions of the Silmarillion in that sense. In terms of this. Because if we're dealing with a monotheistic framework, all of this is going to essentially sort of follow, right? And I'm highly critical of um, any kind of monadic or oneness of being kind of theological or philosophical frameworks. I'm much more of like a pluralist in my ontology, right? So I'm not a oneness. So I don't. I think that's a great critique that not only would everything be like ontologically sourced, but it's essentially a psychological sourcing as well. So yeah, no, I think that's awesome. I think it's a
Yes,
great
and
way
I
to look
think.
at it.
Sorry.
Oh, sorry, Armin. No, jump in, please.
No, I was just going to say that very fractality that you were attributing, and correctly so, to Tolkien, is visible in the organic reality itself. We are in a sense extremely fractal and shadows of shadows, or reflections of reflections. Not necessarily shadow, because not every reflection is a shadow. Let's put it like that. But we are reflections of reflections, and we reflect each other, and we mirror each other, both pleasantly or unpleasantly. There are aspects to reality that reflect back at us. Let's say you get a feedback that is pleasant. Oh, great, this happened, cool, nice. But there's a lot of reflections as well that, are not as pleasant. And both of them, it's not a matter of good and evil. And that's what the point I was trying to make about, the knowledge of death applied in the books as being the same as the knowledge of good and evil, because it is the association of pleasant with good and unpleasant with evil. It removes the capability that the unpleasantness have to reveal. Because that's why I say, and this is something that I've said in I think it's on record somewhere, Silas, maybe you can remind me, in a conversation that I had with Silas, that I think that, quote unquote, and I'm talking symbolically here, okay, but quote unquote, the first sin of all is pride. And it is pride because it's a self-image that rejects something of itself that doesn't match that perceived self-image, right? So you think, for example, I am good at this, yet there's one aspect of a part of you that isn't as good at that as, the others, right? So those parts that aren't as good as the self-image will be removed, will be rejected. But those parts don't go away the same way that like you've said, and like I just said previously, that when you switch off the dream, let's say, they don't disappear, they are still there. The thing is, they are moved away from your consciousness, from foreground. And what happens when they are put in the quote-unquote void is that they will gather power and eventually grow and grow and grow, because the message that they have has to be heard. You can't exist continuously, for an indeterminate amount of time, continuously rejecting a part of yourself, even if that part goes against the perception. And of course, now applying it to the actual society we live in, we are programmed almost from birth, practically from birth, to wear masks, social masks, and to pretend that we are characters in a stage play, in a LARP, right? And of course, what that does is, while we play those roles, we are rejecting very legitimate parts of our own being, right? That we should and could manifest, even if it's dissonant. Now, bringing back that thing about Melkor, even if it's dissonant to society, those are things that should come forth. And of course, if we reject them because of social pressure, programming, because we get a perception of who we are that is completely outside of what we actually are, that message grows in power and may become aggressive, in the sense of you don't hear the first time, it knocks louder. You don't hear the second time, it starts banging the door. You don't hear, you ignore a third time, and it knocks down the door and comes in bursting and pushes you against the wall. You're going to listen, you MF, right? So, and that's usually what I call the tower moment, associated with the tower card in the tarot, which is when you think that finally, everything is stable in this image, in this self-image, then the tower comes down. Right. There's one moment of a zap and the tower comes down, which is when all the potential of the spring, you can consider it like symbolically a spring, is pulled back and reaches a point where it's the only way to go is to be released. And so that the full power of that rejection comes forward in an instant. Hopefully it's not an occurrence that everybody has to go through, but it may occur if the rejection is there for too long. I'm sorry to rant on about this, but this is a passion of mine anyway. So.
No, I want to hear the rant. That's what I've meaning to talk to you for some time. I want to get your perspective on these things. This is a great way to do it. So that's that's awesome. Well, Silas, did you have something to say? I know you were going to hop in, but
yeah. I think
Yeah.
it relates to what you see actually on the next page, which is it states, "Then Iluvatar spoke, and he said, 'Mighty are the Ainur, and the mightiest among them is Melkor, but that he may know, and all the Ainur, and I am Iluvatar, those things that ye have sung and played, lo, I will show them forth, and ye may see what ye have done, and thou, Melkor, shalt see that no theme rather may be played that hath not its uttermost source in me, nor can any alter the music in my despite. For he that tempteth, this shall prove but mine instrument in the devising of things more wonderful, which he himself hath not imagined." So it's almost like Iluvatar is this. It's not even retrocausal. It's actually beyond time and space. It's the quinta essentia of being. In fact, it's even beyond beingness. It's this sort of holistic form, and everything that comes after that are the reflections. Like what you're saying, Armunn, they can be shadows, or they can actually be reflections of sort of fractalized or refracted light. So you can have both positive and negative, but all are sort of eidolons. They are spectres, they are likenesses, they are images. But fundamentally, Iluvatar as the sort of prime or primacy of being, everything is working up to that. It's all the sort of fatal slope to that. So Iluvatar can know of himself, and this, of course, is really what we're discussing here is pantheism, which is interesting because what you find as well, or what I've found at least, with Tolkien's work, is he's sort of wrestling with the concept of theism, where God is sort of, there, but he is distinct from man. He is perhaps remote. And this idea of pantheism, which you also see sort of smattered in speckles throughout the Abrahamic faiths, of course, Catholicism being one of those, which Tolkien was a part of. So, in that sense, I think what you're seeing here is, yes, it is playing upon Paradise Lost, but it's almost it's almost like he's trying to work out what he is. Is he a pantheist or is he a theist? Because Iluvatar is both simultaneously. And I get this sense, I don't know if any of the rest of you do, he is both remote, but he's also imminent and immediate, which is, it's a sort of strange contrast. He doesn't take a necessarily a distinct position between the two. It's almost like he's philosophically debating himself. And in an interesting
Absolutely.
turn of fate, this is what Iluvatar's doing when he's creating the world, right? He is creating these sort of fractal questions, seeking the answers.
He is dreaming the dream that we were talking about, right? So, and everything, the elves, the eventually the orcs,
Oh, we've lost you there, Armunn.
Uh-oh.
It was so great. It's just completely set fire to the Discord algorithm.
Oh, sorry. Did you lose me? Oh,
yeah, we just lost you there. Just for a brief second. You say after dream the dream. If you can continue on from there.
So dreaming the dream. So everything, the elves, the orcs, the hobbits, the dwarves, the Balrog, Morgoth, everything, Sauron, men, even Tom Bombadil, which is the most interesting perhaps character there that is it has very little attention. is parts of Eru Iluvatar. And I am not saying that reality necessarily is a dream of one being and that we are aspects of one being. That's not what I'm implying. What I'm saying is that from our individual perception, we can only see reflections of ourselves, right? Nothing comes into view, let's say, into direct contact with us that isn't also a reflection of us. This is, I don't know, you could call it a sort of, magical reality in that sense, but it is what I observe. That's why I am not a proponent, for example, at all of chance, right? Which doesn't mean that everything is predetermined either, right? Because as soon as the original changes or realizes something, the reflection changes. Right? So it is not predetermined. There is a will that guides, and I think that will is implied, is written in to the reality itself. Right? So we are supposed to apply will, and one of the things that we are most bereft of is the usage of that will, right? Usually through the delivery of what would be that will onto an externalized surrogate decision center. Right? And that's exactly what increases, of course, the level and the unpleasantness of the shadows, because then you are rejecting a very necessary and healthy part of who we are. Sorry.
So what would you mean by, like, and how would you argue for, like, everything is a reflection of ourselves? Like in what sense, I suppose? Like, I'm sitting up here in my house looking out the window, some kids outside trying to hit a baseball with a bat. Like, in what sense is that a reflection of me? Like,
Well,
I guess I'm looking maybe looking for a little bit more specificity. Like, are we talking about, like, the current air pressure, over my house, whatever that is? Is that like a reflection, or are you talking about, like, once the mind gets to, like, a sort of, it's a point of meaning making, that as you create, establish meaning in your
mhm.
combinatorial processes of taking the world and understanding it, that in that meaning making, you divest a portion of your perception to the making of the meaning, or is it more like thoroughly ontological, like
Yes,
an idealism, essentially?
that last part too. But what I'm trying to say is that everything, even the place where you are, the fact that we're having this conversation, for example, is a reflection both of us, and of Silas, and of Zeal that is listening, and of Sayo, and of anyone that listens to this recording. And what I'm trying to say is there is an objective reality around us that moves also on its own, but that our context in it is reflecting us as well. Do you understand what I'm trying to say? It's like if I give you a deck of cards and I tell you to pick a card, which is basically what happens with tarot readings, for example, right? The card that you are going to choose is the card that, although it was supposedly by chance, because imagine there's no way of knowing which card is which. You remove a card completely, supposedly at random. The card that you remove is the card that you are supposed to read. Understand? Not in a predetermined way, but because we are active participants. That's why I said will before. We are supposed to be active participants in the world, in reality. The physical body is a part of that too, and physicality is a part of that too. But before the physical comes the mental, and before that perhaps comes the willpower, let's say the call it the spirit, whatever you want to call it. But all of this are cascades of our whole being. And the problem is that we see things separately within ourselves. We see ourselves separated from the world. That is actually one of the, when you get to read the book or listen to the audiobook version that Silas did, that's one of my arguments in the book, is that the humans are always, or man, whatever, are always depicted as external to nature, external to the world, and even put into contrast or into opposition to the world, because that is exactly where we are supposed to be, within the world. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here, right? And so, if one is not, if one plays a character, if one performs a role in someone else's story that does not come from your will, it does not come from your individual manifestation, call it whatever you want to call it, whatever word is best, then what you are going to reflect is someone else's story, right? It's like, okay, you are hired to, perform in a movie or perform in a theater, a play, and you are given a script and you say these lines, and everything in that performance is going to follow that story, right? Because you were given that script. So while you are performing that play, you are basically reflecting someone else's mind, someone else's existence, someone else's being, right, into manifestation. And during the performance of that. Now, if you don't know that you are in a performance, that is the problem, right? Because there's no end to it. There's no, okay, applause, and we leave, and now I become me again. No. What happens is that we continuously live someone else's story. Most of us, at least. Not, of course, I'm generalizing here. When we understand that we are active writers, if you want to call it script writers, of the entire reality as well, then things begin to change. The reflections change. You see that the reflections start to match you. Something deep in you that is far more you than you've ever been before. Right? And, you were talking about the kids trying to hit a baseball. If I never knew or had contact through social media, because I'm in Portugal, we don't have any baseball culture here. Imagine I never knew what baseball was. If I went there and saw what you're seeing, I would say, what the fuck are these kids doing? Right? Yeah, it must be a game of some sort, but he's trying to hit that with the stick. I mean, whatever, right?
I would say a spot of cricket, anyone.
Right. So to me, to me, it would be alien, that behavior, right? To you, no, they're just playing baseball, right? So you are within the story. You are within, and so are the kids, that they're playing baseball and not playing any other game because that's what they grew up with. That is the script they are inserted in, the cultural, background, etc., right? But what I'm trying to say is that most people live someone else's story, and therefore that reality that is reflected back is someone else's reality.
Well, can I make a quick point, a quick interjection?
Go ahead. Yeah.
Eros, sorry. To sort of briefly summarize that, effectively everything we're seeing within society is not even talking about the sort of combinatorial processes that leads to meaning, right? Of course, these things as isolates outside of our own subjective interpretation of them they have no value within the objective reality, right? That reality that is beyond the human mind, beyond our grasp. So fundamentally, for example, taking the baseball analogy, baseball itself is based upon a script. It's based upon a set of rules. It's based upon traditional structures, things such as that. And of course, the children are sort of nodal reflections of that. And of course, our interpretation of the meaning thereof itself is a sort of downstream nodal reflection, right? So what you find with societies, taking what Armunn has stated and sort of extrapolating it, is that societies are mirrors of mirrors. It's a hall of mirrors. It's nodal reflections reflecting meaning back at nodal reflections, and so on and so forth. Of course, until such a point that society ceases and a new society begins. But if you go all the way back to the basis, the foundational pillars of any society, of which all human cultures, though they may diverge, they all have certain sort of building blocks. You could call them sort of the social nucleic acids that are inherent to their societies. One would be, for example, the culture of cuisine, the culture of music, the culture perhaps of dance, the family structure, which is itself the nucleus of the society, so on and so forth. Those things reflect out from our own biology, from something that's perhaps deeper rooted in us. So in a sense, it's like the tree. The biological substrate would be that of the roots. The main branch would be that of the sort of main nucleic pillars that we mentioned, and then all the limbs from that diverge in weird and wonderful ways, though they appear random to us. There's a deeper order within that chaos. That's all that chaos means, really, a deeper order that human beings cannot necessarily comprehend. But all of the bifurcations of the limbs from that main branch are fundamentally the divergences of culture that we see throughout, the panoply of them throughout the human species. So in that sense, everything becomes like a Lichtenberg pattern. In a sense, it both bifurcates and reflects simultaneously as these sort of as consciousnesses interact, as the agents of the culture or the society interact and reflect and bifurcate from one another.
And even the past, because, for example, you can, and I'm sure all of us here can relate in some way. If not, please tell me. But if you think back to an event in your lifetime that you were there, that you witnessed and acted a certain way, and you look at it and you no longer think that it really happened to you. You know you were there, that you witnessed this, right? But it's like someone else's story. Why? Because the perceiver is no longer there, right? So the past became someone else's story. So the problem here is, even if history, and we're talking now societal level, right? Even if history was a careful, painstaking, accurate record keeping of everything that happened, it would only reflect those involved. It wouldn't reflect us necessarily, right? I'm not saying not to have memory. Of course, we have memory for a reason, and there's a healthy place for it. The problem is that when we treat history, even our personal history, as an absolute, we get stuck in that role, in that particular role that most probably isn't even us, right? And we are unable, therefore, to perceive the reality that is thereon freely, let's say, with that will that I was talking about. And let Eros jump in. Sorry, he's been trying to speak.
No, that's okay. It's just that That's okay. There's a lot here though, and I'm like, oh, I'm trying to keep track of everything. So okay, and I'm not trying to be difficult here at all. I'm just trying to understand here and see what I can inculcate into obviously my perspectives here. But so I just quick insight here. I've mentioned this before, but my perspective, I essentially take on William James's pluralistic universe concept, where there is a constant vying. There's not a monotheistic source. There's not a monad or a oneness of being, but there's a plurality of beings, and then these beings essentially are in competition for narrative. Right? We put it that way. There's competition of perspective. So I guess that would kind of line up with what you're saying about like different stories or perspectives or narratives, or different masks, right? That everybody sort of has, and then this idea of like, oh, wearing somebody else's mask or a mask that was given to you or a story that's not yours and sort of living by that story. That's something that one maybe ought not to do. And I could definitely understand that perspective and agree there, at least to some extent. I guess I'm getting a little tripped up here though, in terms of when you say that there's these multitude of perspectives, and if you take on someone else's story or perspective, that it's not your story or perspective. How does that fit though with all phenomena that you experience are reflections of yourself? Because their story would then be my story, because it's a
Sure.
reflection of myself once I'm aware of it, right?
Yes,
So then
but
it's
yes, but it doesn't match who you actually are, because I do think that there is a, let's say, core self. That's what I call the will, the essence, whatever. There is a core self that is individual, that has its own attributes, characteristics, whatever you want, its own existence. Right? And if what you are performing doesn't match that, then the reflections is someone else's. Right? And this generates, because you reject your essence, let's say, and this generates necessarily and inevitably, in my observation at least, a reflected shadow. Right? So it projects a shadow, first of all, which is projecting that rejection in the first place. It's saying to the world, I am not me, even though everyone involved in the world, although they are unaware of that, their essence knows that that is not you. Right? It's the same way that when someone is trying to sell you a lie, and you can see through them, that they're lying, right? You can see that he is not being honest, right? So you react to that perceived liar in a different way than you would to someone who is being honest, who would express an opinion that is honestly their opinion, right? Of course, I'm talking about not in the conscious level, but in the backdrop, let's say. So if we live in a story that does not match that essential individual being, then that happens. We live someone else's story, there is a rejection, and inevitably shadows come. What is trying to be done, or what the attempt to sort of minimize the self-reflection that would come from those reflected shadows, what is done at narrative level is that you insert into the story itself, the narrative itself that people live, the LARP, you introduce these moments of rebellion, of cleansing, of catharsis, etc., to give a sensation that something changed. It's like, for example, you go through a revolution and you change from capitalism to communism, right? If capitalism became narratively too oppressive, communism is going to be seen as the savior, right? Then you go into there and you start seeing that it's the same thing, right? And you go back to, okay, after a certain period of time, communism is the evil and capitalism is the, everything is seen in a binary to avoid the actual realization of the self. Because you externalize, you start seeing the reflections as not a mirror of yourself, what you're doing quote unquote right and what you're doing quote unquote wrong, and here right or wrong in the sense of matching or not your own individuality, but as something that happens to you. So you are a victim of circumstances, you are a victim of life. Were it not for Trump, were it not for the Chinese, were it not for the terrorists, were it not for, I don't know, COVID, this wouldn't have happened to me, right? But the truth of it is that if you were caught in a situation, it is because during the build-up to that narrative situation, you were living a LARP. The fact, for example, I can tell you that without knowing, I didn't know, for example, that what came about in 2020, 2021 would come to be. I never imagined that such a blatant script trick would be played. So I didn't know. But I was, at the time and for several years, trying already to individually discover who this essence is, who this individual essence is, and I started acting accordingly. It's the little things that I would pick up, the glimpses that I would pick up. Okay, this is LARP, this is me. So go in the direction of me. Go in the direction of me. What happened was that in 2020, 2021, I was in a situation that sort of safeguarded me from all of that. The reflections back at me weren't as, oppressive as it was for other people that were in the LARP. So you understand what I'm trying to say here in terms of the reflections? Is that when you approach being you, right, you are safeguarded more because you are in your story from that someone else's story. And that someone else's story in the social sense is a complete fabrication, as you know, right? But it is a fabrication that people make it their own. Right? For those kids to be playing baseball, they have to make baseball their own. Right? So therefore, they are compatible with baseball. And if a famous player passes them on the street, they're going to ask for an autograph, as if he's this important, ultimate figure in their lives, for example, right? So what I'm trying to say is that as you approach this essential self, this essential individuality, which in my book I compare to, let's say, the Christ, right? Not the external literal Christ, but it's the Christ, the symbol. I think that the gospel is a fairy tale that was written with a specific purpose to depict these dynamics. And as you approach that internal Christ, right, you change that reality around you. Not change in the sense of a magician kind of thing, but in the sense of the way things work out. The synchronicities, the synchronized events start leaning more towards that story than the other story that you were immersed in the first place. I don't know if this makes more sense or not, but yeah.
No, it's a lot. We're dealing with a lot of different aspects here, all kind of converging on these different points. So it's easy to forget, which is why I'm trying to, correlate here as much as I can. Armunn, would you say that the soul essence, like sort of the essence of what you're speaking of, so is this constitutive of drives, or is this more of like an intuitive feeling? in terms of directing.
It manifests also as will. It's a it's is before the will, but will is the manifestation of that essence. Do you understand this? So it's like, you have the potential, but you have a battery, right? And the battery has a potential for a voltage, right? But when you apply that voltage to power something, right, then it's the application of that potential. But that application, that voltage, came from the potential that was latent in that battery, right? So in this metaphorical way, the essence is the battery and the will is the voltage. So I don't know if this makes it clearer for you, my idea.
Yeah, a little bit there. I guess, yeah, I just suppose that because if based on what it's like, the essence is sort of this intuitive drive sense, right? Like so, like you said, like it just, if you hear a narrative and it doesn't sit well with you, so it's like a feeling sense. And
yes,
then
let me give you a concrete example. Maybe it will help you.
Yeah.
Because this happened between the last stages of last year and the beginning of this year. Late 2025, I was starting to get a sensation that I wasn't in the right place, the right physical place. That it was, this was a sensation. Nothing wrong per se at the time yet was going on, but I had this sensation I wasn't in the right place. I hesitated. I didn't do anything about it. And little things started happening around the house. The fridge acting up. There was a supposed leak in the kitchen. Then we realized that it was the neighbors, but nonetheless, something that required attention. And I still hesitated. I still didn't do anything about it. And Portugal was hit by several storms, and I'm not saying that I created those storms, of course, but the context within the timing of things. It's one of those storms. The skylight in the building we were living in flew away, so it was basically removed from with the wind. Flew away. And I still hesitated back then. Then, in the continuation of the storm, since the skylight was missing, there was a canvas that was put there until someone could go and replace it. And that canvas ripped with another storm. It started raining inside the building. I came out. This was an apartment building. I came out to help the neighbors because the water was basically, would flood the lower floors if nothing was done. So, at least put some buckets or something to collect the water, etc. And when I come out, and I'm doing these things, a metal bar that was on the roof is, pushed by the wind and falls down the shaft. That metal bar missed me by 5 seconds because it fell exactly where I was 5 seconds before. When that happened, it still hit me on the shoulder, but it didn't hurt me. As soon as the metal bar, that I saw the metal bar fall so close to me and hit me on the shoulder, I realized what it was. Immediately, I knew. At that moment, I knew, oh, okay, message received in that sense. And I knew that essence I'm talking about was talking to me, the mind character, saying, hey, I've been trying to tell you that this is not the place you should be. Okay? So that was the moment when I made the decision with my wife that we should move. And interestingly, in less, I would say even less than a month, all the paperwork we, got rid of the other house, found a house quick. It was on one day we found the perfect house. All the paperwork fell into place. Everything was lined up, and here I am, the new house. And here, everything is fine. In that regard, everything is fine. Everything is falling into place, and all of those things. So here's an example, a concrete example that I could continue to reject the quote-unquote message. I call it message. It doesn't mean it's an actual message per se, right? Message as we usually use the word. But I could continue living that part, that layer of inauthenticity. I was where I wasn't supposed to be. And when I say suppose, I'm talking about essential self. Okay? Since the moment that I listened, everything coordinated around. It's as if, quote unquote, I was creating, generating the incidents around me, or the events, synchronized events around me for things to fall into place. I wasn't generating. I was just in the flow of who I am. Right? And if you do not oppose that flow of the essence, if you not put yourself in between the voltage, you don't get a shock. Let the voltage flow. Right? The battery has a voltage, let it flow to what it needs to power. Don't stand in the way, let's say. So I didn't stand in the way, and that has been my practice, like I said, increasingly for many years. Didn't, again, happen all at once. It was increasingly and gradually. But this is an actual example of how that essence, let's say, talks, quote unquote, and makes itself known as, what the will should be, let's say. And when I say here should, I mean, we're using language, but I think you understand.
Okay. Well, I don't want to take the whole conversation into just like, what do you mean by this? What do you mean by that? And what's trying to understand every aspect. I need to read the book, or I didn't know there was an audiobook. So I didn't know you guys did an audiobook for it. So for me, it's much easier to listen than to read with my short reading time that I have these days. So I'll have to listen to it to try to get a basis, because I don't expect you to be like, hey, Armunn, just detail every aspect of your philosophy to me in 2 hours. I don't want to. That's a burden.
Silas,
you wrote it down.
Silas did the reading. Silas did the reading, and he can send you the link. I'm sure.
I'll send it over now.
Yeah, send it over to me. Yeah, send it over to me. I'm working through one audiobook now. As soon as I'm done with that, though, I can hop into that one. I guess to state a little bit more of my position, and I'm not sure if it exactly lines up. And then we definitely got to get into like a little bit more Lord of the Rings stuff here. But obviously, how we interpret this is going to be coming obviously from our perspectives here. But my perspective is essentially one of, so like when you're talking about like the generation of like what you call like mass, or these narratives, or perhaps what you mean by like mind characters, right? I essentially believe that is what consciousness, what the mind does, and that's its purpose. So we are simulacra generators. That's what we do. We are deceivers in that sense of it's simulacra all the way down, and it's archons all the way up, as I like to say. And by what that means is like, no matter how far down you collapse analyses, it's going to be simulacra and simulation. And then when you ascend up that same pattern, there's rulers or archons, or that is limiting factors in terms of like specific categories of like understanding in that arena of simulacra production, right? So we categorize these things as like fiction, or we categorize these things as like metaphysics or religion, right? Those are sort of like archon based nodes in terms of simulation. And we could say like, oh, well, you're you're superstitious and you don't walk under ladders or something like that, and that's a simulation, that's a simulacra, right? Because it's not really reality. But the analysis of that situation and pronouncing it as a simulacra is itself simulacra, because that is what the mind does. So from my perspective, maybe to use some of the terminology, there is no getting away from wearing a mask. You are 100% of the time wearing a mask, because any amount of perception is mask wearing ipso facto by definition. So that it's not so much are we wearing a mask or are we not, but which mask am I wearing in my current phenomenological experience? For what purpose am I wearing the mask?
Absolutely agreed. Absolutely agreed.
Okay.
I
Awesome. Cool.
do not say, and I state that in the book as well, that it's not the problem. The mind character isn't the problem. The mind character is a healthy function of a healthy psyche. The problem only is if the mind character does not follow, let's say, that will that comes from the individual core. Say, but just to state that it was in agreement. Absolutely, there is a healthy place for a mask.
Okay, awesome. Yeah. Go ahead. Go ahead.
It's almost in my sort of failed thing that I was trying to say. It's like what you state in the book, Armunn, right? So the it depends who is the author of the mask. Is it you, or is it the system? And fundamentally, we have to sort of break apart what parts. But once we gain the lucidity to what the system is, what parts of us are the system, and what parts, of course, are of the, as you state, Armunn, the essential self. And it also goes into false memories and things like that, which takes us on to Numenor. And if we can get to some of that,
nice transition, yeah.
Yeah. There was a thing that I came across a wee while back, and it was just a really short YouTube video and it's titled "Is Numenor the Atlantis of Middle Earth?" And also its subtitle is "The Lost Kingdom in Tolkien's Lore Explained." And of course, Tolkien. I think I do actually here. So he states in letter 131, quote, this is Tolkien, "The fall of Numenor, the second fall of man, is a special variant of the Atlantis tradition. It is based on the ban, limitation of the power of man, the desire for immortality, the cheating of death leads to the total loss of the world that was." And of course, the cheating of death itself is almost a sacrilege against Eru himself, because this was the gift that was provided to man. And it states in the Akhlabith, the Silmarillion, quote, "And all the fleets of the Numenorians were drawn into the abyss, and they were whelmed, and Numenor went down, and the sea flowed over it, and the world was changed," unquote. And then there's Dr. Sebastian Morello. He did a very interesting discussion with that of the Two Cities podcast. I forget the host's name now, but he stated, quote, "The men of Numenor wage war on the Valar in the hope of obtaining life everlasting." This is, of course, once they come under the purview of Melkor. "Their great sin is the sin of late modern man. They confuse their natural eternity for an infinity in a finite world, and they are plunged into the abyss." And just to sort of colour that idea, we see that, quote, "According to the Tolkien scholar John Hutton, the story of Ungoliant and Morgoth is comparable to the account in John Milton's Paradise Lost, in which sin conceives a child, death, by Satan. Both sin and death are always hungry. Satan says he will feed them and leads them to the world." And so what I want to ask is, firstly, like Sauron, Melkor, and Saruman, how do they tie into, let's just call it, the sort of managerialist drive that we see present, I would say, in the modern world? And moreover as well, this sort of Rakshata, this hungry ghost, this insatiable appetite that you find with both sin and death, and that of John Milton's Paradise Lost. How does that relate to consumerism? And are we the modern Numenor or Atlantis? What are your opinions upon that? And perhaps if you want to sort of expand upon the lore of Tolkien's Numenor or Atlantis itself.
I would say first that the Numenorians were only deceived or tempted, or whatever word you prefer to use, by Sauron, because they had it in them and they were rejecting a healthy part that then became unhealthy. They had the knowledge, first of all, they had the knowledge of death, which is basically represented in the literary works as they were mortal. And they couldn't accept fully ramifications and the entirety of who they are with their limitations. Because death is merely one of the limitations. They had others. They couldn't fly either, right? And so that particular limitation they couldn't deal with. They rejected that particular limitation. So they were subject to be tempted, to be deceived by Sauron. And this is just to also comment on something that Flight of Eros said previously that I didn't get to reply to when he mentioned the Archons. And when he said correctly that in that regard, since we all have mind characters, we are all deceivers in that sense. Yes, and if we are all deceivers, which I agree, right? Some are deceivers for someone else, and some are deceivers in alignment with themselves. Deceivers in the sense of we never perceive things as they absolutely are because we are limited, right? And the mind is limited, and perception is limited, and the senses are limited, etc. But if we are deceivers in that sense, in the sense that you're talking about, then the Archons are reflections of us. The Archons are the minions of Sauron talking to the Numenorians saying, yeah, you have to do this because if you do this, you acquire, you go beyond the limitations, right? But when they say you, they are talking to a mind character that is convinced that is something else, right? That is convinced that they should, I don't know, be Valar or whatever, right? Or they should be the Einar even, right? That they should be, it is their right to be the highest beings, whatever, in the creation of that lore, of that setting, right? So if, and I used to be there, but to be honest, I am not anymore. Let's assume for the sake of argument that Archons are real. If they are real, they only affect those that are compatible. It's in the same way that if you have a liver problem, you drink a glass of wine and you get sick. So is wine evil? So you drink a glass of wine and you get sick, not because of the wine, but because you already have a lifelong set of choices up to that point that led you to have a weak liver. Right? So it's the same thing here. Right? It's not the flies will only go to where the trash is. You don't see, and when I say trash is organic matter, whatever. But you don't see them in a place that is clean. Understand? So that would be my comment regarding that previous thing about the Archons. Regarding Numenor is compatibility as well. They were already they were, by their own choices up to that point, already deceiving themselves. And therefore, when the temptation manifested, it was merely the manifestation of all that buildup of potential that was already stored. And I think that whether he was aware of it or not, that is what Tolkien was manifesting there.
Yeah, I would. I may hold a slightly different viewpoint here. Again, coming from James, that I wouldn't say that in totality, that flies, for example, flies will only be present where the trash is at. But because from my perspective, the universe is pluralistic, it's a plurality of wills. So I'm very Nietzschean in this sense. And there is like a will to power, will to life, if you will. So it's a, also I'm big on Whitehead too. So it's sort of this concrescence of these multiple vectors of will interacting, right? And it's all a net of interactions. Everything is connected, but everything is not one. So everything is there's a connection between everything. So everything's vying for power. So an entity can impress its will upon me, its narrative upon me, its influence upon me, whether or not I am receptive to that will or not. The attempt can be made, at least. Now that might be a failed attempt, because if I am not receptive toward it, if the soil isn't, prepared very well for it to sort of plant its seed, then it has much less likely of an effect. So we're not sort of just coasting along in a predetermined universe where everything's connected and everything's going to move in a certain way, and there's nothing I can do about it, so to speak. I reject like block universe theory and all these, predestination and all these other forms of theories of time. But rather that it is a vying. Now, that's not to say that you cannot, that there's no possibility of attraction, right? I can attract those things to myself, or things that would be displeasurable to myself in some way or another. But I just wouldn't say that it is done exclusively through attraction. So for the Numenorians, it's the seedbed would definitely have been laid through other means, such as, they're experiencing the extension of life, living for many hundreds of years, but not immortal as the elves are. And Sauron or Melkor, same kind of deception at play for the most part, essentially putting their finger on an area where they would be weakest, and that is like the unknown, right? What would be beyond death for them, right, in the story. And then putting their finger on that, they can begin to manipulate them. So I think it comes down to a vying of it's competition, it's evolution in my perspective. Wherein why doesn't Aragorn fall for this, right? Or other characters, you can pick any character you want who doesn't succumb to these things. Well, I don't believe that it's just inherently because of their essence, maybe not being an attractor for it, because then, and this, I'm not sure if this is exactly what you're saying, Armunn, if it is or isn't, but just saying in general, it's not just whether or not one is an attractor or not, but being a very active participant. It is down to the actual willingness and participation in the world, and that is governed by the representational consciousness. So that there is very much a battle of wits, a survival of the wisest, to quote the book, right? In the sense of that there is an amount of wisdom and a navigation of the simulacra and the employment of simulacra generated by the representational consciousness that is required to help navigate. And through that process, you can dodge, weave, attract, dissuade different influences upon you. So it's in some sense, and by that I mean to a degree, a battle of wits. And so uh, when you if you were to take that position, what this does is this is sort of a call to arms, to use the term, and by that I mean one not only has to do an internal investigation of themselves to determine attractant or not, but there also needs to be an active vying in the world, which we all do, whether or not we want to admit it. Anytime you go out and interact with any form of phenomena at all, you are in this vying process. We then have to take up a sort of battle of wits on a daily basis. And since, again, I subscribe to a pluralistic universe, it's not just a battle against myself, an internal process, but it is a process that is both internal and external, because an external entity can impose its will and its perception upon me. And I think in the Numenorians, I think we see that combination where it's not just that the Numenorians would be like attracting so much the trouble of Sauron, but Sauron himself, with his own drives, his own wills, and his own simulacra representational mind, is scheming and conniving, and it's a battle, right, between whether or not he can deceive them or not, and he does deceive, of course, most of them.
Yes.
And that is done in part because they did not do the internal work that is needed.
Sorry, you were going to say, Silas?
Yeah, I was just going to say really quickly, the distinction between, for example, most of those you see in the Fellowship, specifically Aragorn, and perhaps Sauron, even Melkor, the discord that he did so, that itself was almost again, as you stated, it's an interaction of equal wills, this pluralistic universe, but it's almost this managerialist drive, for example, that you see in Melkor, is the rejection of that. It's it's seeking to supplant authority vis-a-vis power. Now, it was quite an interesting point that Dr. Sebastian Morello brought up, because I never really thought about this distinction before, but he mentioned that authority is almost the right, and you could say it's based upon this desire to interact between a network of equal wills, thus sort of creating the universe vis-a-vis that, as opposed to Melkor, Sauron, even Saruman, this managerialist drive. Even the managerialists themselves in our own modern world, they seek power, which is the ability, this ability, this sort of overbearing, relentless will to not necessarily interact with equal wills, but to actually dominate them.
Yes, Silas. However, one question would be, why are they successful in seeking that power? Why are they successful? Are they, in general, successful in applying their power, their will over the others? Because the others do not apply their own. And this is the key point that I was trying to make, is the only way for one will to win over another is for the one that is tempted to have already made that will theirs and have left their own will behind. For that to happen, it means they have rejected, for some reason, they have rejected their own will. Some it's because, it's hard. It's the easier way. It's more comfortable to accept the other's will, for example, right?
Yeah, it's the abdication of responsibility, with
responsibility.
Your will.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So what I'm trying to say is exactly that. So before they were a tempting target, they were the name, I don't know, appetizing target, or there's a particular word that is evading me. But anyway, before they were an appetizing target, they had to have had a build-up to that point where they were relinquishing the responsibility of their own will, right? So in this sense, the receiver of that power must first be compatible with the other's will, so for a perpetrator to exist, there has to be a victim, right? It's like the codependent thing, right? For a master, there has to be a slave. And the slave wants the master the same way that the master wants the slave, right? So if the slave is no longer a slave, in their own psyche, it's no longer compatible, they lose the master. The master notices that all the power was a perception. Right? And the same happens the other way around. If the master stops being a master, the slave will go crazy and will look for another master as quick as they can. If they haven't, again, regained their own will, their own individual source, whatever you want to call it, right? So this is what I'm saying about compatibility, is that for them to be tempted by Morgoth, it was Morgoth or Sauron? No, I don't. It was Morgoth, right? That tempted the Numenorians, right?
The Numenorians was a Sauron.
Sauron. Okay, for them to be tempted by Sauron, they had to first have a build-up that could have happened in the shadows. It doesn't mean that it was, when I say in the shadows, is in the background. It doesn't need to be visible. In the same way that there was that prediction of the fall of Gondolin, right? That Gondolin would fall, and no one could see how could Gondolin fall, right? But the behind the scenes, it was already happening. Was already there. The compatibility was already there for the betrayal, for everything that happened. I don't know if you read that particular.
Yeah, definitely, yeah.
So this is what I'm saying. Before even the attack, right, all the things before were done by the self to the self. Not the self, the core self, but the mind character convincing itself of something else. And so this is why I say that the system, if you look around, the system is performing a service that they're being paid for to most of the people. People would go crazy if all of a sudden you pull the switch and there's no system anymore. People would go crazy. I'm not saying that the system is needed because of that. What I'm saying is that it's the people that make the system. It's the victim that does the perpetrator. The perpetrator is a manifestation of the victim in that sense, right? Because we're not talking about a natural hunting situation. This is not a natural hunting let's say, prey-predator relationship. We're talking about something completely different. Because it requires a parallel perception of the self and of reality. Because the prey looks at the predator and knows that it's a predator. Okay, let me run, let me hide, let me whatever. Right? And the predator looks at the prey and knows instinctively that it's a prey. There's no lie there. No lie in the sense of, a machination to, let's see if I can trap in here and there and the other. That doesn't exist. So I'm not talking about prey-predator. I'm talking about something different that can only originate in the compatibility of the quote-unquote victim of this to actually fabricate the will to power on those that are compatible as well. Because if there is no victim, then he won't. They won't. They can't. It doesn't work. Sauron would be talking alone, right? In the void.
that actually brings us to a fantastic segue, and I'll first pose this idea or this question, and it's Eros first, but. We read from J.R.R. Tolkien's letter 131, quote, The rounding of the world is the end of the second age. Before that, the world was flat and the undying lands were physically reachable. After the catastrophe, the world is bent. It is made into a globe, so that whatever way a man sails, he will only come back to where he started. The way is closed. And I found that really interesting because I see that as almost symbolic, right? It's this idea that there's, like what you're saying, it's a codependency. It's not necessarily a traditional predatory relationship. It's a dependency that creates a sort of managerialist, materialist loop. Where, for example, right, let's just contemplate the idea that the system tomorrow vanished as we know it. Well, firstly, all of our culture, most people as well don't have physical books. You don't have physical things, cultural artifacts, if you will. And most of the repository of all of our wisdom, our knowledge, our culture, everything really, is to be found on digital records. Of course, even prior to that, it would have been found in libraries. And these libraries were typically closed off to most people, either physically closed off, or they were closed off remotely through, of course, mass illiteracy throughout the given society. So in that sense, this dependency itself is almost like a rounding of the world. And so, just lastly, it's I don't know, it's hard. It's a hard way to sort of describe it, but it's hard to sort of describe it. But is it because the sort of managerialist loop that we see with this sort of symbolism of the rounding of the world, and even this predatory relationship which we're talking about with the archons or rulers, and how they utilize propaganda and how they direct the simulacra, the creation of simulacra within the society. Is that is it really down to this idea that man has abandoned God, almost the Nietzschean idea of the death of God, and that man, in that sense and in that circumstance, ultimately seeks to become God? So, for example, in terms of what you see of the managerialists, and this is why our liberal societies have become so authoritarian, perhaps, similar to, let's say, Numenor, with the chimneys and the destruction and the dark smoke. Even says as well, in those days man began to slay one another and they walked eternally in fear. Is it because that man, and the managerialist class rather, seeks to control omnipresently, omnisciently every single facet of life, because they're almost taking on that similitude of the role of God, or the similitude of the role of, I don't know, what would you call it, the essential self, that thing which you feel beyond the dependency. I don't know how you would describe it.
Silas, there, I would replace there the word man with the word mind character. Because what happens to an abandoned mind character, and when I say abandoned, is not that it was abandoned per se, is a character that turned its back on its own essence, its own ego that is the vehicle of the essence. What happens? What happens is that it's lost, right? And by being lost, it has to fabricate its own godhood because it feels cut off from quote unquote God, which is that his own essence, right? If I was a deist, I would have said that experience that I told you about with the metal bar and the things happening around the house, I could say, oh, it was God talking to me. Of course, I know that it isn't God in the sense of, a theist would say, right? But you could read it. It's an interpretation as any other. You could say that it was God. Right? Your God. Your inner God inside of your own essence being, let's say, right? So if you are cut off from that, you must build a surrogate God, an external God. You, therefore, with the God comes the realm. So you must change the realm to match that God. which is, a sort of completely fabricated Frankenstein monster of a god, but nonetheless, it's the god you can get, right? Because you are cut off from the actual organic god in that sense. So you were talking about the globe being the the perception, let's say. I would say that what makes the globe acceptable, and here it's not a discussion of the shape. We're not turning this into a flat Earth or a globe.
No,
thing.
It's entirely symbolic.
Symbolic. So, what makes the globe acceptable in perception, in mass perception? The globe is only accepted because there first is accepted the mass perception that the world is all known. Right? So, if the world is all known, it is a globe. Because then you would ask, okay, and what is beyond? Because let's imagine it was flat and with a dome or whatever, right? And people would ask, what is beyond the dome? The world isn't all known. But if you accept that the world is all known, which you can't know for yourself, it's absolutely not. You can't. But if you accept that perception, and it can perfectly become a globe in your own mind. You accept the globe because the world is known, and all the world is mapped. Let's say you are given the map. Let's say. So it is the same thing at play here. So I just wanted to comment that.
What do you think, Eros? How does this idea that we see in Numenor, how does it perhaps tie to what we're going through? I guess you could call it, the managerialist revolution and things such as that. Do you see any parallels, and how would you describe perhaps the Atlantis as a myth? Is it a warning, or is it just something that recursively and eternally occurs?
Yeah. Well, in terms of like the symbology, just to start with the difference between that flat plane and the globular Earth. Of course, on when the Earth is flat, and when Arda is flat, to the west there's the Undying Lands, right, Valinor. And so, if you just head far enough west, and if you have the permission of the Valar, et cetera, you can get to the Undying Lands, right? But that's cut off once the Earth is remade, and formed into a globe. Now it's like recursive. It's like internally self-referential, right? And notingly enough, is pretty much when Numenor falls and the Earth is remade into a globe, we essentially start marching towards the age of man as well, right? And getting to that point, and then obviously after the third age and the destruction of the ring, the elves begin to depart, and now it's the age of man. So it's all about man now, right? Dwarves are gone, elves are gone, and it's just man at the helm of the ship. And he's at the helm of a ship on a globe Earth. And that globe Earth, I find it to have sort of this direct metaphorical correlation to the mind itself, because the mind is like recursive. Like it is, and Kant essentially pointed this out, but that if you transverse like across a globe, upon the surface of a globe, you have an infinitely extending horizon, but it always returns to the same point. So in much the same way, that's essentially like how our mind works, in the sense that because we are not omniscient beings, we have limited awareness, right, of different ideas. We have a horizon before us. There's a horizon upon which you can't see, both locked in from time because we live within a duration. So I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, right? Exactly what's going to happen tomorrow. I might have some intimations or some intuitions, or I can look at the stars and say, well, it might be somewhere in this ballpark, but I don't know exactly the events that are going to take place. So because we are limited beings in terms of time, we have a duration. We don't know exactly what's going to happen the next day. We also, there's an expansion sort of limit point in terms of how much we can actually know. It's ever continuing. So you can just, the number series runs on forever, right? Ludwig Klages points this out, that once you begin the intellectual question, it causes an infinite fractal sort of regression almost, or expansion really, of simulacra production. Because anytime you make an assertion, we can start making assertions about that assertion, and we can make assertions about those assertions, and assertions about those assertions. Is Zeno's paradox, or similar to it, right? And that's what the mind does. Is so you can infinitely transverse a globular plane. You can't infinitely go across a perfectly flat plane. You're eventually going to get to the undying lands. You have this endpoint. But coming into the age of man, with our reason, with our representational consciousness, that knowledge of the tree of good and evil, Hegel says that, and I think it's a good argument. I really like this one, and I'm going to butcher it. I don't have the exact quote. I got it from Zizek, and I don't even know where that book is right now. But Hegel says that when man eats of the knowledge of the tree of good and evil, the serpent tells him that, your eyes will be open and you will be as gods. Then once he eats, right, Yahweh says, hey, look, now man has become like one of us. So it's not the awareness of good and evil that is the signifier for divinity. It is awareness itself. It's not the good and evil. Just, you could put anything in there, any duality. That's not the point. Hegel points out. Hegel's saying that it is the representational consciousness itself is what is evil. It, quote unquote, right, evil. And because what it does is it causes this infinite expansion of possibilities, which then places man upon a Promethean projection, a vector, basically. Because now we have this infinite expansion, or like Deleuze would say, like this sort of infinite difference that can come about through representational consciousness. His book, The Logic of Sense, gets into all of this, and he uses Alice in Wonderland as an example, as sort of like a metaphor, symbology to show this. But this infinite expansion is reflected in the earth itself, and we can get into this. Gets into other things we spoke about as well, because this gets into like that fiery internal core of the earth generating this connection to the sun. We've talked about this before, right? But we're on a sphere, and so it's this sort of infinite process. And so what it does is it sort of puts us in this grindstone where you have we're trapped, and it's not just that we're trapped like physically. That's not it. It's not like, we're in a it's a soul harvesting, situation. That's not what I'm talking about. Before that, even, you're trapped in your mind, right? There's no escape from the sphere of the ontology, essentially, of your mind. You are a simulacra production machine, and that's just what you're going to do. Now, Buddhists try to escape. Christians try to get to the undying lands and escape, right? But there's no escape, because to escape is to completely erase consciousness itself. And the moment you have consciousness, you have this process. That's why I said it's simulacra all the way down to the planular worm, right? And go ahead.
And it's not a trap. That is
Right.
That is also a perception. It is what it is. It is the because there's this idea that incompatible mind characters is very prevalent, which is that you have to know everything in order to exist. Right? You have to know where you are, what it is, how has it come, etc. Right? You don't have to know. You don't have to know everything. You have to know that which is, within your scope of knowing. Right? The rest, it's not that you can't work with it, that you can't navigate it, but it's not up to you, and I'm talking you, the mind character, to know. You can't. You're not equipped. Mind characters are not equipped to know. They can't. It's an impossibility. Right? But they, when they find that all of, we really can't know beyond this, and they make up stories, right? Let's make up a story to fill in this gap in our knowledge, right? And so you come up with whatever kinds of stories, be it religious story, be it scientism. You come up with a scientific theory to fill in a gap of something that you absolutely can't know. You're not equipped to know. Right? And so that is what is depicted in the knowledge of good and evil, which again in the Numenorians was the knowledge of their own mortality, is that then you stop being in alignment with your core self and manifesting what your core self, for some reason that we can't know again, is supposed to manifest. Right? And you start living a story that either you made up or that someone made up for you. Because then you can become a victim, compatible victim for someone else to fill in that gap for you. But when they fill in that gap for you, then you're trapped in their perception system.
That's sort of like what I mean, though, is that that's what humans that's what humans do. We make up stories. Yes. That's part of the simulacra production, and that's what Tolkien is saying too. His essay on fairy stories. This is what humans do. We make up stories, and that acts as a positive feedback loop to our engine, if you will. Maybe what you would say is like the essence to then drive us towards a certain end. Now you're going to pick your end, right? And some people think it's heaven, or what have you, but that's what these stories do, is they drive. Otherwise you just have nihilism. That's what Nietzsche said, right? Our stories are dead. We killed God. There's no overarching story anymore. So now the only thing that's left is pure animal drive, right? And so then we're just going to consume ourselves like Ungoliant. You have to generate sort of like your own story or reality or what have you through your own perceptive, reflective consciousness and navigate the way forward.
Yes, and that's why I said, and I argue this in my book, that to me, I think that whoever originally wrote the gospel story, they were fabricating one of those stories that you're talking about that was an inspirational story. It was to convey the mechanics of the psyche, dynamics of the psyche, better said, because it's not a mechanism per se, but the dynamics of the psyche in a way that can be conceived, because the mind characters need metaphors for that reason, right? Because we can't know for a fact, we can't know firsthand as mind characters, right? So the stories also do that. But then that very story was used in a different manner. Eventually, whoever did it, I mean, that's not my point here, right? But absolutely in agreement that the stories have a healthy place. We are, as mind characters, we have that ability with a function. It has a healthy function. Part of that healthy function is certainly not the idea that we can know every little thing. It's like you go sail a boat, and you can tell yourself, because you're a scientist and you studied that at the university, you can tell yourself that you know how the wind is generated. In fact, you can't. You can't really know how the wind is generated. The wind goes, and when it's in, blowing in this direction, you point the sail towards. If it's in that direction, you move the sail around, and you navigate using that wind. You can tell yourself, I know the wind is the result of the differences in pressure and you can tell yourself, right? And I'm not saying that science has no place. Again, everything has a healthy place. The problem is when those things become absolutes, then they replace the one aspect, replaces all the others. And all the others then become rejected and eventually, inevitably, they have to turn into shadows. And they will bite you in the behind, right? So this whole rant was just sorry to agree with you, because it is I am in agreement in that regard. Yes.
I would say as well, there's, and you sort of alluded to it, Armin, I don't know if you were conscious of it, but there's a distinction between awareness and knowledge. So
Yes.
if we understand Eru Iluvatar as, let's say, the truth, right? That itself, not, for example, that's the objective reality, not necessarily bound to perception by consciousness, right?
What? Sorry, let me just
yeah.
interrupt you there, because Eru Iluvatar is already a perception. He has a perception of himself, and that's why he sees Melkor as dissonant. Right? Because if he was without perception, in the sense of being a complete awareness, he would know that there are parts in him that would cause that dissonance, that there are those present in his throne, the throne room in that story, that would be dissonant and create a different melody to his, right? So just to put that point there, but do go on, sorry.
Well, let's say then the sort of pre-Genesis state, right? Even before Eru Iluvatar had any conception of himself. So the truth would be the sort of that irresolvable horizon point, let's say, right? The knowledge itself is almost it's a conscious being stating that my opinion, which is their sort of, like what you're saying, that it's their need for to find the determining cause for a certain phenomenon within their either peripheral or within their direct environment. So they'll craft these stories, right? And this is why human beings are a storytelling species. However, eventually there is a distinction between the awareness that's brought out through those stories and knowledge.
Yes.
Knowledge is this, it's almost an implicit statement that you are God, that you have this vantage point where you can almost hubristically know of this causal determinant factor or your model of explication as being correct. That you see it in modern science as the law of this, the law of that. So we've taken our phenomenological sort of maxims, understandings, you could even say, these awarenesses, and we've said, well, this must be extant throughout all of the universe. Of course, science does make the sort of the partial implicit statement that yes, until of course we prove it otherwise, but ultimately that's not how it translates to the wider society, right? To the wider society, these things they just are.
Absolutely.
And anything that goes beyond the bounds of that, what eventually becomes dogma, because again, most people take the path of least resistance, at least when it comes to their own consciousness. They take on that role. So fundamentally, what you see is when he states they have become like us. It doesn't really matter knowing the difference between good and evil. It's that you become both good and evil, capricious, similar to Yahweh, right? In Isaiah 45, I create both the light and the dark. You become that because you have you've made that implicit statement of knowledge, and I think that's fundamentally what it's sort of hearkening to when it speaks that. In the Bible.
Exactly. Yeah, no, exactly. What it's stating that we are the devil. it's taking both sides of that sort of like ultimate religious duality of like the holy God and the defiled devil, and realizing that both of them are essentially eternal in us, right? I mean internal, not eternal, internal in us, right? That's the whole point. That's pretty much sort of like Hegel's point, and Schelling goes on to bring this out even a little bit more after Hegel, but that um, it is the awareness itself, because this goes into a little bit deeper philosophical musings and what have you, but because the production of sort of an infinite series of simulacra is possible from that point of representational consciousness or awareness, the being that has that representational consciousness, that ability to project into the future. Remember, this goes back to like my first talk. I keep bringing this up, right? Where it's that perturbative environment that exacerbates that representational consciousness that causes it to flourish. But when that happens, you become sort of the devil, because what you do is that is what allows for the departure from the norm. Okay, this is sort of like an anti-Platonism, because Plato, his whole idea of like representation and simulacra is that you're essentially supposed to try to represent yourself for you to become a reflection of the ultimate good, right? Good and which is like the monad. And so what you're doing is you're trying to become a copy of a perfect representation.
Model.
And so this, yeah, a perfect model of the representation. But really it is the what allows for the change, what allows for any kind of fluctuation against entropy. Because if you just become a pure copy, once you reach that static state, it's a full entropic environment. There's no connection anymore. It's just, you're just a perfect model. There's no change, there's no flux. So what ends up happening though is that representational consciousness allows for dissonance. It allows for the change in the harmony, right? And then once that dissonance can happen, that's how you get a multitude, or like a rhizome spreading out into multiple directions. And then those rhizomes branch and those rhizomes branch. So in that sense, because you become rebellious, if you will, or you become the detractor from the norm, you are, you know, the devil. You are considered to be evil because it's a departure from the standard fare of doing things. And so that's what the awareness is. Now the problem is that, and again, this is essentially what Hegel was saying, is that God or Yahweh wants to be the only one who gets to do that, right? Who gets to determine how far things go. And once mankind now has that, then we become a direct threat. But and that's because of our representational consciousness, we can branch into all these different areas, right? So that so then the true nature, if you will, of man is inherently satanic, in the sense that it is, to use it within that worldview framework, and that it is always one simulacra, one reflection, one step beyond what is then established as the norm. Because by our very nature, we have that limiting horizon of understanding. And so we are always seeking, like, the more, we are always moving through time because we have a duration. And so we're always bringing that change, that negentropy, into the world that allows for further connections in a resistance or a fight, if you will, against a pure entropic state where there's no more dissonance.
Well, this sort of ties in. This is another great segue. I mean, you guys are on a roll here. Well, this ties into what I wanted to ask regarding the new shadow. So we see in letter 256 of Tolkien, well, I found that even so early there was an outcrop of revolutionary plot about a centre of secret Melkor worship, and Gondorian boys were playing at being orcs and going around doing damage. I could have written a thriller about the plot and its discovery and defeat, but I would have been, but it would have been just that, not worth doing. And so the new shadow was this planned, and I think he only wrote, was it something like 13 pages of it before he scrapped it or shelved it. And basically it's the idea that was it set 100 years or so after the events of Lord of the Rings, approximately, and Aragorn is dead, and basically the Age of Man is now sort of trundling along, and they have forgotten everything. In fact, it's not necessarily they've even forgotten about everything. It's they've become bored with the good. That's almost the sense that you see within both discussions of it online and, of course, from Tolkien's own writings regarding the New Shadow. So, again, this brings us to the
But
yeah, jump in, Armunn, jump in.
Silas, that is something that actually we already touched upon in previous conversations, which was that we some time ago, I don't know which recording it was, we said that inevitably the a new Sauron would emerge, a new Dark Lord would emerge. Why? Because Eru Iluvatar continued we're talking about this setting, right? Eru Iluvatar kept rejecting the initial separation that he did with Melkor. That he kept seeing Melkor as an external. Well, if he created Melkor, he is responsible for Melkor, and Melkor can only act in a way that he was created to act, right? So again, we're talking about an individual psyche. This story, like all stories, are about the psyche and not a collective external thing, right? But what it means is that the core, the origin of it all, which was Eru Iluvatar in this particular setting, didn't come to the end and say, well, guys, sorry, I'm actually responsible for all of this. So, I'm just going to integrate this whole thing into its own healthy place, and there will be no more shadows and everything's fine, right? He didn't do that, and he won't do that, right? He won't do that because the writer was a man with mind characters, a man with, inserted into a cultural setting, a believer of some things, holder of false memories in others. And so he is actually performing his own, by these stories, Tolkien was talking about his psyche, which, in one way or another, we can all, relate to, because we all share a psyche more or less with the same format, different and individual, but nonetheless with the same components, right? So yeah.
I also think as well that he was sort of speaking to something, perhaps it's a political problem, but it's a political problem that also ties into ontology, and that itself obviously is inseparable from representational consciousness, because that is the aperture which perceives that all of these things, right, and even produces them. It's almost this strange. I don't actually want to say it, but it's almost with the New Shadow. It's like what he was stating is that eventually there is no long defeat. There is no long defeat of evil by good, because the two effectively are both they're codependent, but they're a codependency of entropy or decay of some kind. And that itself of course, it's a decay of the representational, the reality in which we exist within, including ourselves. It decays us. But as we read previously in the Silmarillion, Eru Iluvatar uses Melkor, along with, of course, all the other representations of his beingness, the fractal expressions thereof, as a sort of instrument of his own will. His will to what? His will to perhaps, I don't know himself or something, right? But it would appear that eventually civilizations reach this point of managerialism, because what they find, almost in a weird dark enlightenment Gnostic sense, I guess you could call it, that they must manage the decline they have to manage the decline because eventually all systems will come to rot. Now, that's not necessarily saying that the true essence of the being will come to rot. Human beings will continue civilization after civilization. Sentience will continue, but it's the idea that eventually the unpredictable elements within that said civilization will grow bored with their own good. Is that because, like what Eros stated, we are we are in fact desirous of knowledge, and perhaps we are satanic, meaning we're adversarial. We're constantly adversarial.
Well, the managerialism,
yeah.
the managerialism only continues on, and here I'm equating managerialism with Sauron and whatever Dark Lord came before, and whatever Dark Lord would come after. Only works again because the ones that quote unquote become victims of it are victims of it even before the actual manifestation of the Dark Lord. Again, I bring your attention to the fall of Gondolin. Gondolin was this elvish fortress that was impregnable. I mean, it was absolutely, no one could ever imagine that it would fall. And
they couldn't even find it. They didn't. It totally was basically invisible to them. Yeah.
Correct. Yeah. So it couldn't even be found, and yet from inside the setting, the things were already in motion for it to fall, right? Because there was a compatibility with that decomposition. And so what when you talk about rot, rot is a part of life. If there was no rot, you couldn't digest food, period, and so it is a part, it's not good or evil. It is an integral part of life. It's like you see these beautiful cats, and there's plenty of stray cats here, and very, very playful and actually nice. And you can even, see them bouncing around. So they're so cute. Those cats will murder and mice or birds or whatever they catch, no problem. Are they evil? So are they good when they are playful and evil when they are predators?
They're indifferent. They're indifferent.
They're indifferent, and it's part of the existence itself, in the same way that rot is part of the existence itself.
So this is this sorry to interject? Is this almost akin to the archetype of Bombadil then, Tom Bombadil? This sort of this neutral, almost Gaia-like aspect.
For sure, and that's why I said that before. For sure, Tom Bombadil is the most interesting character in Lord of the Rings, and it's very overlooked. And I think that more attention, let's say, should be given to Tom Bombadil, because Tom Bombadil is really he's almost like if you were to represent, which can't, but if you were to represent in a character form how the essence would be, that would be Tom Bombadil. Because Tom Bombadil is, in fact, all-powerful. He's more powerful than Sauron. He's more powerful than any of the beings in manifestation. Yet, he has no will to power. Why? Because he accepts his place. He accepts his domain, let's say. Right? And that's why I say that if there is no, if we do not diverge, let's say, from our own stories, and yes, we will all make stories, and even Tom Bombadil made stories and songs and poems, but if we do not diverge from those that are our own individual stories, then there is no will to power. There's absolutely zero need for it. Right? People talk, the people that say that we are in a soul trap or we're in hell or whatever, that is their perception. That is because they are in there. They are in that story. They are LARPing in that story. Right? Bombadil is LARPing in his own story. He doesn't even care about what other stories there may be. Right? And it wouldn't, even if Sauron was to win the war, Bombadil would continue on with his own thing, and Sauron wouldn't touch him.
What are your opinions upon this, Eros? Please, sorry.
I think, doesn't Gandalf say though that if Sauron does get the ring, that Bombadil wouldn't do anything about it. Remember at the Council of Elrond, at the Council of Elrond, he said he wouldn't do anything about it, but that something does need to be done, because if we leave it up to Bombadil, then what's going to happen? He's going to lose it or forget it somewhere because he just doesn't care about it. But then the Sauron would eventually get it, and then Bombadil would fade too.
That's Gandalf's opinion, because Gandalf is living in a binary. See, we didn't get to that part yet, but the whole... Well, I did state in the beginning that the writings are Manichaean, and I'm not Manichaean.
Mm-hmm.
And so Gandalf is on the side of good, and therefore he sees existence as a conflict against evil that he must win over, right? So he must defeat Sauron through, the hobbits and Aragorn and whatever else, right?
The light of Arnor versus the light of the false flame of Adun, that what we see at the Balrog,
Right. So he, of course, will see it from that perspective, but we're seeing that from the perspective of someone in the binary. Bombadil is not in the binary. And Gandalf cannot state that even Bombadil would be affected, because simply Bombadil is actually, quote unquote, the god. And he is more powerful than Gandalf, than even Gandalf the White, and even more powerful than Sauron, right? And so, no, you wouldn't fade. I disagree with that part, but I understand that Gandalf sees it that way, because that is the only mission Gandalf has in his existence, is to defeat Sauron. In fact, as soon as Sauron is defeated, he goes to the Undying Lands. There's nothing more for me to do here, right? So, that is my opinion, at least. That's the way I read it. I'm not saying that I'm absolutely right about this.
I'm reading here as well. Well, it's essentially what you're saying is that he can't even necessarily comprehend indifference because he exists within the binary. But we read here as well that in Sindarin, Elvish, his name, Tom Bombadil, was Irwin Ben Adar, which is either old, young, or fatherless. So again, he's of both and neither at the same time. So it's almost, he is perhaps the axis mundi. He is the spirit of nature in that sense. He is the thing that is perhaps closest to Eru. Sorry,
that's what I was gonna say. Yeah, is that he's like nature, and why Gandalf? Obviously, everyone knows Gandalf has this very specific mission, right? Where he's coming from to try to he's a big participant in this war, and actually at the end of the Lord of the Rings, right, when he's with the hobbits and they're like, "What are you going to do now, Gandalf?" And he says, "I think I'll go visit Bombadil," right? And he says, and Gandalf says, "I've been a stone cursed to rolling for many years, but he is a moss gatherer," right? So what he means is he's a rock that sits there and gathers moss. And Gandalf's like, "I've been at this job, for however 100,000 years." Doing this, trying to assist in this war. Now I've been rolling this whole time like a stone. Now I'm going to sit with Bombadil and gather moss. And so here's the thing, though, is that I guess my point, and I'm welcome to be corrected on this, but my point is that we don't have an option as long as we are conscious, but to be in the binary. Not so much the binary of good and evil, but binary, because that's what representational consciousness does. It's reflective. So by definition, two, right? So there's always going to be a binary. Now, if you want to get rid of that, that's Buddhism, right? Where you try to destroy the ego and destroy the representational self, basically, so that you enter into a pure flow state of nature. which is the Bombadilian nature, right? Where he's just in pure flow. That's why he can get the ring, he puts it on his finger, he laughs at it, he makes it vanish, he makes it reappear. But he does that because he's not a participant. And that's what Gandalf is saying, is that he's not participating in the world. So he's kind of like a Buddha nature almost. He's like non-participatory.
But the difference between Tom Bombadil and all the others is that he is in a binary, but he's in his own binary.
Mhm.
He is still in his binary because he acts in accordance to his own vision, his own individual vision of what good and evil, or whatever other binary you want to apply. He acts upon it, but from his own perspective, not from a collective perspective. And the problem comes when good is seen as absolute, evil is seen as absolute, in the sense of a cultural setting. Because
Mhm.
if you're an orc, it's good to you. Under pillage, eating man flesh, that kind of thing, that is good. Right? So it depends on
Right.
where you are. Are you elvish? Are you orc? And why? Because you are collective. The orcs are collective, the elves are collective, men are collective even, right? And so the thing here with Tom Bombadil is that Tom Bombadil is not a man, he's not an elf, he's not an orc, he's not an Ainur, he's not anything of that kind. He is he is him. Right? So it's not that he got rid of binaries, because that can't be, like you well stated, and I agree. And, I've been involved in Buddhism for many years, and I also came to the same conclusion. It's not that he is outside of the binaries absolutely, it's that he is outside of the collective binaries. You understand in that regard. So,
Yeah.
and what the war that Gandalf is fighting, and Aragorn is fighting, and the hobbits are fighting, etc., is a war that is collective in nature. It is collective because they consider that this has to be overcome. What that, of course, generates, and I'm not saying that they shouldn't fight or should fight or whatever, it's a story nonetheless. What I'm saying is that inevitably, from the defeat of Sauron, it is inevitable that a new Dark Lord takes its place. Because as long as they become the representatives of one extreme, the opposite extreme has to mirror them. Necessarily. Why? Because Eru Iluvatar did not integrate both in their healthy place. I am not saying accept evil and give them a hug. What I'm saying is that there is a healthy place before they became evil. Melkor, before he became Morgoth, had a healthy place that was denied by Eru Iluvatar. In the same way that in the Bible, you see Cain didn't do anything wrong before he was rejected. He only started being quote unquote evil after the rejection of God for being himself. He was being him, he was doing his thing. He was a farmer and he offered what he had. He was rejected. And it was that point that made him evil, right? Because he went into contrast with Abel, right? And so then he became aggressive towards Abel. Correct? You understand what I'm trying to say? So it is when these things become absolute in the collective sense, that it always has to self-generate a continuous loop of war. There's this war, there was the previous war against Morgoth, there was this war against Sauron, and there would be a next war against whoever else comes next. So, and that happens inside the psyche. Yeah, go ahead.
It reads here as well, old Tom Bombadil is a merry fellow, bright blue is his jacket, and his boots are yellow. So the idea that you're seeing there is that he almost, I guess you could say, he exists betwixt the bright blue of heaven and the yellow of the sun. He is of that. He is the sort of the combination of the two. It's just perhaps it comes across that he's indifferent, but he's perhaps just merry with it. And this is what we see of Buddhism as well. Perhaps there is no Buddha nature. The Enlightenment itself is just a sort of peace with the you know, it comes across as an indifference of the two, or a non-binary, but fundamentally you're of the binary, you're just at peace with it, in a sense. So that would be Bombadil's character.
And Tom Bombadil
but
saved the hobbits from the it's not the Craig, what was it called? From
the
tomb.
Barrow Downs. Yeah.
The Barrow Downs, yes. Which means that he isn't indifferent. Right? The thing is, he only acts when he himself and his binary understands that it is a moment for action. Understand? And
Yeah.
this is where each individual should inhabit, quote unquote. Not in a collective sense. Yes, we deal with each other. In the same way that Tom Bombadil received the hobbits and was hospitable and so on, but no, guys, rest here a while and go on because I have my own things to do. Right? It's not like now we establish a community here and the hobbits move in and no. You have your thing, I have my thing. We interact. It's all nice and dandy, but move on. Oh, you have that thing to do? Yeah, go ahead, do your thing. It's fine. Visit anytime.
That's what I was going to say. Is that he's still participatory,
Mhm.
right? He still is connected to everything. He's not isolated.
Oh no.
Right. Because he saves them from the Barrow Downs. Their quest would have been over at that point. They take the swords, and one of the swords they take from the Barrow Downs is what Pippin uses to kill the Witch King, right, or assist in the killing of the Witch King. So all these things end up getting threaded together in the future. Anyways, and I just want to make a quick point on Gondolin, because he passed over that pretty quickly. But the king of Gondolin, Turgon, he becomes very complacent because he has this, basically paradise, and it's essentially invisible. It's hidden. Morgoth is constantly looking for it. He can't find it. It's impenetrable, and the destruction does begin from within. But also, it's almost as if, because Turgon was determined, because there was basically, you couldn't let anybody into the city. It was a death penalty if you let anybody in, right? Or if you told anybody about it, right? If you knew how to get in, or you were an elf, you couldn't bring anybody in. They'd have to execute them. And he basically became so prideful in his ability to hide, and so entrusting of his own enclosure, it became like a static environment, like a completely static environment.
Uh-huh.
And then eventually, Morgoth finds a way in or whatever because of betrayal and all this other stuff that happens. And then Gondolin falls. Turgon dies trying to defend the city. But I think that's a good lesson there in terms of if you're on one side of that duality, just like you're saying, Armunn, too heavily in a very absolutist sense, that you can secure an environment, especially through technique, through the use of technology. You can secure an environment that becomes more or less static, right?
Yes.
And
yes,
then
of course.
and then the world, the universe, the environment essentially will marshal forces against that.
First. It's the shadow. Yes.
Right. Because Eros, that fluctuating drive, that flux, that fire of all change, that must happen. You cannot create a monadic static environment or a perfect 1-to-1 copy ratio and then secure that. There might be brief moments like crests upon the wave, or as Whitehead calls them, concrescence, but that concrescence leads to something else. Whitehead's famous saying is, the many become one and are increased by one. So what he means is that you do have a correlation of multiple forces in this like Jamesian multiple a multiple universe world, and then they will come at points of interaction, like we're having this discussion now, and we could say yes, and agree, and that's concressing upon this wave of understanding. But then that is going to, by the nature of our consciousness, we're going to get off this call, and some other idea will be inspired, and then it will continue anew, and that horizon stretches on. So we came together as one, and then we increased by one. And so it's this ever fluctuating flow. And if you ever try to take everything, like maybe like the managerial class is trying to do presently, and create an omega point and say here and no further, right? That's completely working against the entire fabric, essentially, of reality, and it's going to break at some point in that process.
Yes, and also because the only way that you can create a stasis is by altering the perception of the, in this case, mind characters involved in it, to see, it's like what when we were talking about the globe, right? To see this is the world and it's all there is. And so by doing that, they are forcefully, necessarily moving away, cutting off their connection with their individual cores, essence, whatever you want to call it, right? And of course, by doing that, it will generate a spring action, like, the spring pulls back. There's a resistance force that is accumulating, and eventually it will spring back. It will release that spring and just hit. And people will the people that are LARPing like that are in that stasis will, of course, be completely caught out of the blue, as if, the world is ended, right? There is, how is it perceived when there is a big cultural shift in society, other than the world is ending? Right? If you pay attention to people around you that are more involved with a collective perception, you will see that anything that actually shifts that collective atmosphere is seen as the end of the world. You will hear them say things like, "Oh, the world must be ending. That's why the Christian Armageddon and the scientism but the asteroid will fall and there will be a new extinction event, and all these things are in fashion, right? Because culture is shifting towards something else. It's not shifting to something organic or true. That's not the point. The point is that those who are attached to the previous will be compatible with a story about the end of the world. You understand? Because to them, psychologically, it is the end of the world. The world is ending. The world that they inhabited as mind characters, the only world that they could exist in as that form of mind character is ending, right?
There's a server wipe coming, and they're going to have to start up a new avatar. And do a bit of grinding so they can get their EXP up and some money, and bro.
Yeah. Hey guys, I got a jet. But this has been a great combo though. I'm glad we finally got together and had a good discussion. We're gonna have to definitely do some more.
Yeah, well,
definitely, man. Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, jump in, Armunn.
I was gonna say, do take a listen to the Silas's audiobook. And of course, if you, in the next conversation, if you have any other comments or questions about it, feel free. So note them down or something, and feel free. We can discuss it further, or discuss further this Tolkien's thing or whatever other thing. Yeah.
Well, actually, I was thinking, since we've sort of started off with the very nebulous topic and questions regarding ontology and our own existence, the next section I have in my notes, and it's more fleshed out in terms of questions, is regarding sort of the political philosophy and the political and social settlement within the Lord of the Rings. And I was wanting to sort of liken it to the modern world, right? Even down to perhaps what you see in terms of the armors and the architecture of, for example, the orcs, Mordor, Rune, God, even was that Northern Kingdom Angmar, and perhaps some of the sort of Elvish, you see this weird sort of machinic architecture with the orcs, and of course more humanistic or magical, or a sort of a blooming or flourishing culture with men and
Well,
the
tell
elves.
us.
So I was wanting to make the distinction there as well, so
Yeah,
we can cover all those things.
That's because Tolkien was living in his own end of the world, because Tolkien was witnessing the industrialization happening around him and the loss of a way of a perception of life, of human life, social life that he had. And so, of course, the industrializers.
Industrialization.
Yeah, but those that promote industrialization would be seen as
Industrialists.
orcs.
Yeah.
Industrialists, right?
That's the one.
Exactly. Yeah, would be seen as orcs, right? Or orc masters. So again,
you're preempting all my talking points, Armunn. This is exactly what I had in the talking points. I was going to go into all of this. He even hated bicycles as well around Oxford. But no, absolutely. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off there, Armunn.
No, I was done. That was the point. So we are seeing his psyche, because when an author writes a story, fictional story, he will reflect his inner world, his inner psyche. It's inevitable, right? And that is, I'm not saying it's bad or whatever. No, it is useful, and some people can relate to this, other people can relate to that. But we must understand that it will always reflect the author. So he was living in the War of the Ring, right? The war against industrialization, and he made this, of course, fantasy ending where industrialization is defeated in the end. But that's one of the layers of his writings there that I detect, at least. And so I think that was a reflection, representation of his own stance.
We shall get into that in the next video, the next discussion.
Okay.
We'll arrange something. But absolutely, just save that up, save that ammunition up. Right, guys, thank you very much for joining me here, and for the generosity of your time, and of course the brilliance of your points. I'm in awe. So
awesome. Yeah, it was great.
Thanks, guys. Thanks. Bye-bye.
See you, man. Thank you.
Take care.
You, Eros. See you.